Hello, folks, and welcome to Totally Tanked, the tankiest podcast in Tankville. It's August 10th, 2024, and this is episode 61. And today we're talking about the T-62. And, well,
we really stuffed that up, Rob.
I was about to say, we really missed opportunity there, didn't we? But, look, it's not the first time, and it won't be the last. I'm Rob. I said that's the second time I've done that. Yeah. And I'm joined by...
Hello, my name is John, and welcome to Tanktainment's Answer to Wayne's World. Okay, now, if you want an excellent Totally Tanked t-shirt, beer coaster, coffee mug, or cool hat, head over to redbubble.com, search for Totally Tanked. We've also been selling some stickers lately, and those 7 cents we get for each one of those really don't add up, but we really do like the free advertising, so, get on that. If you don't want to spend too much. We will be thanking the patrons later. We will be discussing current events in Ukraine in the second half of the show. But Rob, tell us.
No, we're going to say hello to a few people we've got on the stream so far. We've got Tasman. We've got he's in Sydney at the moment. We've got Shlomo Tenenbaum from New Zealand. We've got Jamie Stokes. We've got Comrade Dar over in Perth. Three hosts in the pub. And yes, now while we know the Wallabies game is on in Brisbane, I think we'll find that today's podcast is a lot more of a winning event than what we're going to see for those people in Brisbane. So that's
you never know. It's the exciting new era of rugby for Australia.
Where we still lose all this.
Anyway, we do have a poll running in the for our YouTube audience on the live stream, which is asking whether the T-62 was meh or transformative. I think you could actually make an argument for both. Probably should have put both as an option, but I didn't. So here we are.
Vote away. Vote early. Vote often.
Just for the benefit of people who are new to the show, this is recorded as a live stream on YouTube, but it is primarily an audio podcast, so we try not to refer to video stuff too much. But there is a lovely slideshow that you can see on our social media in a few days if you're listening on the podcast.
And Etienne, we should enter into the beer Olympics. No, I don't think we're that well trained, but we like the training aspect. But I don't think we're actually very high performers. But we do like to train.
Yes, Wi-Fi Soldiers joined us. No, you haven't missed much at all.
No, we're just saying thank you to everybody and welcome on this lovely winter day here in Canberra, which it's been quite one of the most pleasant. And Russell Phillips in the UK, well done.
Oh, Russell's photographs are in the slideshow, so thank you very much, Russell, for that. We will have to get you into the show sometime soon. Russell's a historian and author, for those who don't know.
All right.
Nice.
Tanks.
Talk to us about the T-62, Rob. People here.
Tanks. All right, tanks. The T-62 also, previously, it was known by its prototype name of the Object 166.
Also a lot of the Object 140 in it. But,
yes,
it's complicated.
It was, well, you can talk about all about those complications as you like. Stats. In service from 1961 to today. It's running around, blowing people up left, right, and centre in various places around the world, whether it's Syria, Peshmerga, or the Peshmerga, the Kurds, the Ukraine, and Angola, probably still doing things there, and all sorts of places.
And look, the reason I wanted to do this now is because the T-62 is becoming the determining factor in the Ukraine war. When are the Russians going to run out of T-62s to refurbish? Late next year on current expenditure. And at that point, the Russian way of war they're going to have to do something very different. So that's why we thought it was important to talk about it. And I always thought it was just sort of, a bit of an upgrade to the T-55. And then I got into it. I was like, whoa, this is actually much more important than that. So, yeah.
I'm still more partial to the T-64 myself. But anyway.
54?
64.
Oh, the 64 is a revolutionary tank.
Yes.
I
know. But anyway,
we'll get into it.
Yeah, anyway. All right. So, unit cost, the cost to when Egypt was buying them in 1972, which is the only place we actually have gave us some firm numbers on, was $300,000 US, which was 50% more than the T-55s at that stage. So that's to provide some context of how it is. It was only produced from 1961 through till 1975. It was all by the Russians, and the Bulgarians, I want to say, and North Korea producing them through the 1980s because they got a license to build them as well. Now, it's worth considering that as it was a stopgap replacement for the T-55, the T-55s was in production until 1981. So it was actually in production as a replacement for the T-55. The T-55 was in production for another 6 years after the T-62 was stopped being produced. And Czechoslovakia even went longer with the T-55. And so it says something about how the T-62 was viewed, and that it was produced, but it wasn't, and it was seen as the replacement for the T-55, but the T-55 kept on getting replaced even while it was, after it was, they stopped producing the T-62 because they moved on to the T-72, and we're thinking about the T-80s and the T-90s and T-64s.
There's a few factors there. One is that the T-55 was so bog simple and reliable. There's a reason it's still running around, third world countries today. The other one was that for all that the T-62 had, what became the defining tank killing cannon. For most, dare I say it, third world conflicts, it's not about tank-on-tank action that much. It's about it basically as a support vehicle, and as a support vehicle, rifled guns are still far superior to smoothbores.
But even Ukraine is not really a tank-on-tank action.
It's not. It's just the thing that's available in terms of the production at the time was with a view to tank-on-tank.
Yep. All right. So we got 22,700 plus were built, so making it the fourth most produced tank ever, behind the T-55, T-34, the M4 Sherman, and then the T-62 with 22,000
It's
plus.
almost like the Russians really have a thing for tanks.
Yeah, well, they weren't doing anything else in the 60s and 70s, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, we do joke that, half the tanks in the world were built by communists, which is our argument when people say, oh, tanks, isn't that a fascist thing? And it comes back to, look at the total numbers.
Look at John's T-shirt and say, tanks are always political. Yeah.
Yes, indeed, that too.
All right.
We had a nice note, someone saying they thought it was the funniest T-shirt they'd ever seen. And I was like, yeah, but you didn't buy one, did you? No, you didn't. But that's okay.
They will next time.
We'll take appreciation.
Yeah. All right, so 37 tons plus whatever gets added into it after upgrades. So there was the Egyptian ones get up to 46.5 tons with all their modern upgrades that they've put onto theirs. Their length 9.3 meters long, width 3 meters 30 wide, and 2.4 meters high. It's got a crew of 4. Commander, driver, gunner, and loader. So still they stuck with the loader. No auto loader in the T-62.
But it did have a really interesting casing evacuator.
Yes.
So it would eject the cartridge in a really useful way. But it always had a slow rate of fire. And the Russian idea was, well, we're going to have 4 of our tanks to every NATO tank. So that'll improve our rate of fire dramatically.
Throwing in a one-piece hunt. Anyway, we'll get on to the armour was a cast steel turret and a steel hull. So yes, one of the last steel-hulled tanks for the Russians.
Which was also funny because it invalidated steel-hulled tanks everywhere.
Yes,
with its introduction.
Yeah. Because its main armour was the 115 mil smoothbore gun, the 2A20, carrying 40 rounds. Typically, they had 12 HVA PFSDS, 6 heat, and 22 HE frag.
I mean, the HV there stands for high velocity.
Yep.
So it really is just APFSDS.
Yes, but back then it was high velocity because they hadn't been around before.
And we will go through exactly how fast they are because it's quite staggering when you actually get into that. But yeah.
So although only 4 rounds are placed in the turret, the rest are stored in the back of the fighting compartment and in the front of the hull, to the right of the driver. Maximum elevation of the gun is 17 degrees. Minimum elevation is 4 degrees, so it cannot do hull down positions terribly well because it can't shoot from the top of a hill down easily.
It was still significantly better than the T-55, though.
There you go.
And that was part of the reason why it looks like a wonky T-55 is it's got all these weird little angles that are 1 or 2 degrees out of true, and that was to fix a lot of problems with elevation and rotation and things like that.
All right. They got a 7.62 PKT in the coax and a 12.7 meter 50 cal anti-aircraft gun. They whacked that onto the loader's hatch, but that only became standard in 1972.
Yeah, it was after the helicopter arrived on the battlefield as a tank killer. They said, we are going to need a big gun to shoot at helicopters with.
Yeah, just throw some rounds down range. Engine, the V55V, based on the Kharkiv model V2. With 580 horsepower, later 620. Torsion bar suspension, ground clearance 425 mils, Fuel. It can carry 960 litres, 1360 with two 200-litre extra fuel tanks that they strap on the back that you always see. So,
and they had quite a funny system for controlling that. More so than previous Russian tanks, the driver had quite a lot of switches to decide what he was going to drain, and obviously the external tank is the one you try and drain first, getting into combat, so you don't have exposed fuel tanks in combat.
I don't think those ones were connected in. It was when they were talking about the rear tanks. They were talking about the internal rear tanks. They drained first.
No,
yeah.
Anyway,
I could be wrong, but that's the way I read it. Is that it have basically within the tank itself, it had 4 tanks of fuel, and the driver could select which tanks of those they would be taking fuel from, and they could set it up so that there would always be one tank that didn't get drained. So even if you drained all 3 of the other fuel tanks within the tank, that's a crazy little statement when you say it, but is that when you've always got an emergency reserve left inside the tank that you can switch over to get you home the last 50 k's if you're running short of your base in the middle of Afghanistan and you really want to get home and not blown up and tortured by the Mujahideen during the 80s. Anyway, 450 k's on road with the fuel tanks. Maximum speed or 320 cross country.
And remember, this is a tank in the same era where Centurion was coming out with 100-kilometre range.
That's one of the points I want to make is that this was definitely designed to be an offensive tank, and whereas a lot of the NATO-style tanks, the M60s, the M48s, the Centurions, had very short ranges of fuel capacity. The Russian tanks, just because they were lighter and they had a more fuel capacity within them, could go further because they were expected to outrun their support as they broke through. There's no point only having a 100k breakthrough, a 50k breakthrough with a 100k fuel tank, because the enemy would very quickly be able to cut off your fuel reserves, and you'd be stuck in the Fulda Gap or the North German Plain, saying, "Well, we'd like to go further to Belgium and the Netherlands, but we've got to wait on the fuel trucks." No, they wanted to be able to drive from the East German border all the way through.
Yeah, and let's remember the famous line when Montgomery was asked in the early Cold War, "What does the Red Army need to advance the Channel?" And he said, "Shoes." That's all they need.
All right, max speed, 50 k's on road, 40 k's cross country, slow in reverse, very, very slow in reverse.
The curse of the Russian T-tank. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, in this one, in 1955/1957, having achieved the T-55 and no longer building heavy tanks, there were many tank designers with time on their hands. They were working on ideas for tanks when the M60 turned up in Europe in 1961. And the T-64, which was already on the drawing boards, was not ready yet. So,
and in fact, wouldn't actually be ready till about 2020. But yeah,
1960. Anyway, so after a couple of high-level patrons gave their go-ahead, they got told they were allowed to build a slightly better T-55. It wasn't allowed to be a heavy tank. That was one of the stipulations, is that Khrushchev said, no, I don't want another heavy tank. I want another medium tank. So,
as we saw in the T-80, Khrushchev was actually heavily involved with saying, no, if it's going to consume this much fuel per minute, then you can't have it. Because he was actually looking how much fuel have we got.
Yeah, and it had to be slightly better than the T-55, but not too expensive. And they used a lot of the T-55 gear, and they made slight improvements on it all. So engine power, torsion bars, ammo, so much so that any improvements that they built were then applied to the T-55s as they were upgraded. So they're all compatible. All the upgrades were compatible.
Yeah, and it was a real work of genius in terms of running such a large army with conscripts, is that pretty much all the systems were compatible. Once you've been trained in one tank, you could fight the other. And that's not to be sneered at in terms of organisation. Okay, now just quickly on the development, Tank Encyclopedia has a really good page on this tank, and the series of coincidences and luck and sliding door moments that led a new tank designer, Leonid Kartsev, at the UK BTM Bureau, which was based out of Ural Vagon Zavod, which is today the Russian tank production facility. At the time in the 50s, it was Kharkiv and Leningrad were the main design bureaus, and this was a bit of an upstart that no one was expecting to really do anything good with. But Russian weapons scientists managed to get personal time with Nikita Khrushchev, and they convinced him that smoothbore, armor-piercing, fin-stabilized, discarding sabot was the future. And spoiler alert, they were right. Now, they did have a towed 115mm gun, which would have been a pain to move around a cannon that big in a towed one. And they basically slapped that into the T-62, and then they said, this totally changes the way tanks fight, and largely for the better. Now, for the cannon nerds out there, it's worth pointing out that I'm going to go with the designation U5TS, but it's the 115mm smoothbore in the T-62. It's very purely designed to fire a penetrator wrapped in a discarding sabot, and to get the very high muzzle velocities needed to interact with steel armor like it's a liquid. So when these penetrators, which are like giant lawn darts, hit steel at 1600 meters per second, it's not like a solid object hitting another solid object. At these effectively hypersonic speeds, it's liquids interacting with each other. And it's a very light package, just 5 kilograms coming out of the muzzle. To get that 1600 meters per second. And when they try and use a different sort of round, like the high explosive or the high explosive anti-tank, it's a 25 kilogram round, but it comes out at less than half the speed. And with those lower speeds, the need for an accurate range solution becomes more important as the round is taking an indirect journey to the target. Now, what are the advantages of a smoothbore? The big one is just less barrel wear. You can get thousands of rounds fired compared to hundreds with rifle guns. Just because the rifling wears away, and particularly if you're using the whole length of the barrel to have your gases expanding, that does terrible things to the rifling. It wears it differently at different points and makes it inaccurate fast. Now, this 1600 meters per second, and modern guns today are more up around 1800, but they've hit a wall that the penetrators aren't effective any faster than that. That's 5,760 kilometers an hour. Or Mach 4.6, or for our American friends, 3,600 miles per hour. That's how fast this cannon fire comes out. So out to about a mile, it's just a straight line, put the targets on and fire, and you're very likely to hit it. American testing found the T-62 with the U5TS was superior in accuracy to the M60 out to that 1600 meter mark, which is basically a mile. Rob, over to you.
Alrighty. Tasman, yes, they did start out, the T-62A did start out with the 100mm D10 gun. That's true, but we'll get into that. Anyway, the round turret, which is the distinctive key tank feature, was good for surviving nuclear blasts, as it made it harder for the blast pressure to damage the turret ring, and also provided better all-round vision for the commander with their head sticking out, rather than the flat-topped and side turrets, especially before the loaders had.
Well, I imagine you can see down the side of the tank much better.
Yeah. They didn't. The loader didn't start out with a hatch, so that was introduced later on, and also the improvement over the T-55 is they had more space inside the turret, even though it had the same weight of armor and better protection. So
that really goes to the genius of Katsev's design, that he was able to get the same weight, but a bigger internal volume and better protection. That was a huge achievement.
It's a great
Now, as we've discussed, a lot of the design of the T-62 was taking the T-55 and tweaking it, but in very clever ways. So there were angles 3 degrees out of square or true, 3 degrees, 1 degree, just to make things work a little better. And a good example of this is that the turret molding is eccentric. So in the T-55, they just had in the mold, a sphere shape on the outside, which is what they wanted, and a sphere shape on the inside, which is what they wanted. And it was in the middle. But then they said, hang on, if we just move the inner shape back, we get more armor at the front where the thread is. But we haven't actually changed the weight of the thing, which was just clever. Now, we're just going to talk briefly on spheres. Rob's mentioned it had some advantages for nuclear attack, but just as a geometric shape, sphere has the maximum volume with the minimal surface area, and that's why bubbles are that shape. And, you can get lots of science demonstrations on that. But fundamentally, they managed to get a lot more protection at the front with a lighter turret that had more internal volume. So to say that this is just an upgraded T-55, and the plan was to get a 15% improvement on the T-55. The Russians used a T-55 in their wargaming with a value of 1, and they were hoping for a value of 1.15 out of the T-62. And what they got with the cannon was actually something very far beyond that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, very much so. They also found, look, when they started looking at the tanks and how they performed, they found the tanks spent most of their time in third gear. So the third gear bracket was beefed up in order to stop those gears shearing off. But they couldn't solve the problems of the fourth gear because the lubricants didn't quite get all the way through the gear track to there, and they had 5 gears all the way going up. But but they didn't bother with. In the end, they didn't bother trying to fix that fourth gear problem because it was rarely used. So basically, it was just you either staying in third gear or you're making your way through to fifth and going at the speed you needed to go at. The track turning ability had a very useful happenstance in that the driver could use the track turn levers on both tracks at once, which would shift the tank into a lower gear without the need for the driver to take the foot off the accelerator and change gears. This was very useful when the climbing hills and obstacle crossings when you needed to maintain power to the engine. So essentially, if they, rather than having to take your foot off and say, okay, I want to drop down a gear and lose power to the engine and to the tracks and so forth, they could just pull these track turning gears both at the same time, which would then essentially pull it down a gear and say, right, go from third to second to first, whatever else, as you're climbing up your 30 degree slope, which is all they could do, or 32 degree slope.
The 32 degree slope's a very steep slope, but anyway.
But it's also, I mean, when you're trying to traverse obstacles and other bits and pieces, you're saying, I want to keep going forward without stalling the tank, because stalling a tank is a bad idea on a slope when people are shooting at you.
Yeah, a lot of bad things start to happen after that. Yeah.
All right, so it was before the days of an autoloader, but without an autoloader, it appears it's to be less prone to the turret ejection system that the T-72s and everybody else's get. So I'm pointing at my T-72 T-shirt here now with the POW as the turret goes flying off.
To be fair to the T-72, and also the T-64 and
80s and 90s too,
all of them with the Russian carousel ammunition ejection system, anti-tank weapons that fired a shaped charge at 90 degrees to its flight path to spear through the top of the tank didn't exist when they were designing it. So that is a threat that's been literally created to attack that vulnerability since.
Now, without an order, it was to stop the other ones. To stop spent rounds bouncing around inside the turret, they designed an injection port at the rear of the turret that would automatically eject spent rounds. This did mean that the gun had to elevate to a certain position to eject the round, but this angle also allowed the loader easier access to the breech. So they didn't have to raise the round that they were trying to load in after the spent round came out to such a high degree that it was easier for them to shove it into the breech.
In gunnery terms, they call it return to battery, where the gun makes itself available to be serviced and then returns to the firing position it was in before.
All right. Yeah. This also meant they had to have the turret maintain an overpressure environment to stop any nasty air getting in when the ejection port was opened. The tank was designed for nuclear environments, but not chemical or biological.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those funny things that they were designing all these vehicles, and the Westernizers are doing the same thing to fight through a nuclear firestorm. And it's like, well, that's very clever and ingenious, and I applaud your ingenuity, but it's like, well, what's the point? You're just a bunch of skeletons fighting over a graveyard at that point.
It's interesting that, the West didn't have any chemical or biological that they were planning to use. They were only planning on using
I don't trust the British, but yeah, British are always ready to use something nasty.
But there was plenty of other people who were going to be using chemical and biological. See Saddam Hussein in the 80s. It was, and he had plenty of them. All right. They also introduced a hydro-pneumatic clutch assist mechanism that reduced the force required to depress the clutch, leading to less wear and tear on the weak point and less reliance on driver skill. So when you don't have to have, when you got conscripts, which is who was mainly driving these tanks, you don't have to rely on them being terribly smart or useful. You can if you can build something that says, you know what, rather than the bash in the clutch and change the gears like a T-55.
We go back to the T-34 where you literally take a sledgehammer to clout the gear shift with. So again, the Soviets, I should say, did show a capacity to learn from their mistakes that's worth remembering. And partly it was because they had these competing design bureaus engaged in many ways much fiercer competition than the way Western arms producers rely more on lobbying and bribery to get their effects. But yeah. Okay.
So its average speed on road marches was 32 kilometres an hour, and off-road marches was about 22 kilometres an hour, and which was good for the time and the fuel economy and the distance. Which was designed as an attacking tank. It was more important for the Soviets than the short ranges of the NATO forces that we're talking about before that would have been on the defensive. Now, conflicts.
Here we go.
All right, there's a lot of conflicts. But anyway, whilst not as widely exported as the T-55, the T-62 still got around and was involved in a lot of conflicts, even if it wasn't the most numerous tank in the field. So take all these events with a grain of salt, that there would have been other tanks of the period probably around, but in a couple that was the most numerous tank. So 1968, it rolled into Prague as part of the Prague Spring Offensive, basically to put the Czechs back in their place and say, stop being too liberal with your government ideas and get back in line with the Soviet, the Eastern Bloc style.
Poor old Czechs. Czechoslovakia is one of my favourite places in the world, and that they really had the short straw being where they are in the world. But yeah. I mean, I guess their history has created what they are. But anyway, yeah, let's move on.
All right. The 1969, the Sino-Soviet border conflict. All right. There's lots of history about unequal treaties, Uyghur, self-determination, islands in the stream, that are getting caught out shit-talking about an agreement you're about to sign, which there was a lot of diplomatic conflict going on with these with the borders on the map.
But, I mean, the Sino-Soviet border also had the issue that a lot of the border disputes, the White Russians had signed deals with the imperial Chinese government and just no one actually recognized these agreements signed between two defunct regimes. And then nationalist China made some other deals, but they were replaced by the communists, who again were saying, well, we didn't sign this deal.
And realistically, there were islands in the stream. So there was ways to say, okay, the border is this river. Okay, there is an island in that river. The island either belongs, if you look at it this way, belongs to these people, this side, or if you look at it from this other, generally held convention of how you separate islands in rivers that form a border, then it would belong to this side.
Well, it's hard because conventionally you work on the middle of the riverbed, but riverbeds change, and then it's like, who owns the island?
Well, it's not conventionally. There are different conventions. That's the point. There are different standards on how you do it. So eventually, two patrols in the back of nowhere ended up opening fire on each other, and then there were tanks involved, and the conflict got out of hand a bit, and eventually had to. There was a T-62 that got immobilized in no man's land, where the conflict.
I think we got it in the slideshow.
Yep, it would have been, and the Chinese were very happy to. The Russians could not, or the Soviets could not take it back, so the Chinese were very happy to capture that, bring it home, look at it, and say, "Oh,"
and reverse engineer every bolt and nut.
That's a good idea. Those are good ideas. Let's see if we can't build some of those. And so they've still got it in their National Museum of War, or whatever they've got their name for their place is, and said, So that was one of the big defining moments for the T-62. It was captured by the Chinese and formed the blueprint of what they were going to build for themselves. All right, 1973, the Yom Kippur War.
Which you tend to think of as more a T-55 fight, but the 62s were there.
Yeah. Well, they were, because Egypt and Syria were the main buyers of the T-62 at that stage of the world, where their lack of gun elevation for the Syrians hampered them from hitting the Centurions and Pattons sitting on top of the hills, and they lost. Well, the Israelis captured at least 132, I mean the
Tehran's. The Israelis liked the T-62. It was one of the interesting because they've used them in a very significant way since they captured all of them. 1961 to 1999, the Kurds
have in various countries, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and so forth, have captured a number of T-62s, but also there are plenty of countries have been using T-62s against the Kurdish forces and the Peshmerga forces in those areas. So yeah, it's just an ongoing conflict with all those sort of things happening. It's not a defining tank for those battles, but it is there and it is making people's lives miserable, as it would be. All right. Eritrean War of Independence against Ethiopia.
Now, hang on, the dates on that. 1961 to 1991, a 30-year war of independence. I actually think the Eritreans are one of the cooler people in the world, and the way they have managed to fight their way, often with lots of T-55s, to the independence they enjoy today. I just admire them. They're great. They're good. They seem like they're good fighters. So I'll give them that.
Yeah. There you go, and then they get into the Ethiopian Civil War. So after they lost, Eritrea got their independence. Then there was conflict within Ethiopia itself, as everyone was blaming themselves, each other, as to what was happening.
Now, hang on, the dates on this. So the Eritrean War of Independence ended in 1991. The Ethiopian Civil War ran from 1974 to 1991. Basically, after the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of things got sorted out elsewhere. But yeah. And in fact, what's next? 1975 to 1991, the Western Sahara War.
I'm not sure that one's real. I think that I'm not sure that one's actually finished. There's a lot of things happening. Western Sahara is a pretty lawless place.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there.
Yeah. So anyway, yes, the Polisario were given T-62s by Algeria in order to fight the colonizers of the Morocco and so forth. And basically, they were the indigenous peoples that saying, yeah, we're not going to recognize, after the Spanish and the French left and the Moroccans tried to take over, they said, we're not going to recognize external law. We're just going to manage ourselves. And so the Algerians, who had also kicked out the French at that time, were providing them with T-62s to run around with. All right. Supposedly Cuba got involved in Ethiopia during the Ogaden War. So I always knew they were in Angola, but I didn't realize they were and the Yom Kippur War.
Didn't Che Guevara die in Africa?
No, okay. That was South America.
Time in Africa.
Bolivia. Yeah. Oh yeah. Look, well, I don't know, but or maybe I think it's Simon Bolivar. I don't know. Maybe
Simon Bolivar less involved in the African wars of the 20th century, but yeah.
There's a lot of places. All right. 1978 to 1987, the Chadian-Libyan War conflict. Now,
that's the Toyota War, isn't
it? Which ended up becoming the Toyota War in late in the 80s, 86, 87. Again, Libya having a number of T-62s. The Chadians and
Chad just had Toyotas,
and with French-supplied Milans bolted onto the back, and they took out a number of T-62s with that part.
But I would say, in general terms, reliability and ease of maintenance was what made the Toyota a very effective. Toyota Hilux is a very effective weapon for Chad in that war, but protection still has its own value.
1979 to 1988, the Soviet-Afghan War, Soviet Union. T-62 with a lowered power engine and a wide ratio 5-speed transmission was found to be better suited for the use in mountainous terrains than the T-72s. So that's why
interesting, because it's basically the same engine, but maybe a little lighter. Don't know.
For whatever reason, it was better geared for mountainous terrain than the T-72. So.
Okay, 1979 to 1989, the Cambodian-Vietnamese War.
Yes, so the Soviets supplied Vietnam with T-62s in 1978 in order for them to use as part of their occupation of go into Cambodia.
And let's just stress here, Vietnam invading Cambodia at this point ended the murderous regime of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge and the killing fields. Yep. So it's not normally a good thing for a country to invade another country. In this case, the Vietnamese deserve a lot more credit than they get in the West for putting an end to this horrible thing.
Yeah, that's what I'd say. So in the 80s, when there was a sore loser, and the US were essentially a sore loser when anything in Vietnam came up.
I'll talk to Cuba about that today.
Yeah, and also the UK was also involved, and they would both of them would rather convince China to support Pol Pot and recognise the Khmer Rouge as a legitimate government at the UN than appreciate that the Vietnam had stopped a murderous regime that killed a quarter of the population of Cambodia. So 2 million people out of 8 million people dead. So 1 in 4 people dead because of the Khmer Rouge. All right. They also
Sorry, I just want to address. Comrade Dar has asked: Are T-55s and 62s not easy to maintain, or just less reliable than the Hiluxes? The issue is the Toyota Hilux is the most durable and easy to maintain vehicle humanity's ever devised. The T-55s and 62s are pretty good, but nothing's in Toyota Hilux league.
No, and the spare parts for a Toyota Hilux you can get anywhere.
Easy to get, yeah.
Whereas tank parts are probably around, but not as much.
I guess it comes to the point, a tank needs daily maintenance and hours of maintenance to stay in operation. A Toyota Hilux can go years without a mechanic looking at it.
Yeah. And they also destroyed, basically put the country almost back to the Stone Age with their economic activities. And they were also crossing the border into Vietnam to massacre thousands of villages. So not saying that and we're not saying that the Vietnamese occupation was a bed of roses, but no one else was doing anything to help the people of Cambodia, whereas, as I said, the US and UK were actively trying to convince China to help Pol Pot maintain a legitimate government.
The US and the UK did not give a damn about the dying that was happening as a result of their policies, which should not surprise us looking at world events happening right now. But,
but point being, as always, you got to say that somebody coming in and stopping that with a bunch of T-62s is much better than letting the murders happen.
Mm-hmm.
All right. 1975 to 2002, the Angolan Civil War. So that was Angola, Cuba, and UNITA. Angola was given a number of T-62s by the Soviets, and Cuba brought their own, or else had their own there, but they had plenty of troops on the ground and with tanks. 1980 to 1988, the Iran-Iraq War. So Iraqi T-62s smashing Iranian chieftains and Pattons was one we talked about when in the Patton episode.
Let's go back to this just for a second, because basically the as we've talked about, the chieftain and the Patton were the last of the steel armored vehicles, and after that they realized that you needed something better than steel to be worth carrying around. And obviously, Leopard 1 was the response saying, let's dial the armour back to a minimum. And then Chobham laminate armour came in with the M1 Abrams and the Challenger and said, no, we can actually make armour that works against modern threats. But this was the moment where the T-62 finally got to, on level ground, because gun elevation, it had problems in hilly ground. On level ground, it was fighting chieftains and Pattons and really did a number on them, and the gun did exactly what it was designed to do.
Well, they were actually on high ground, and the shooting down, but they were able to come over the hill to depress their guns so well enough that they were able to take out the chieftains and Pattons that were stuck in the mud.
Sure, but I'm just saying the Iran-Iraq border is flatter than, say, the Golan Heights.
Yes. So, God, yeah. And welcome, Alan, from in Idaho this week.
Hey, Alan. Okay. Good to see you again, mate.
All right. Okay, we've talked about the Toyota War of 86, 87. Okay, then we go into the Lebanese Civil War of 82, 83. There was plenty of them sitting in Lebanon and getting taken over by various factions, and then the Israelis coming in and shooting them all up. Right, 88 to 93, the Georgian Civil War. And that would continue on for a couple of years, while longer as well.
And then you had the Russian invasion of Georgia a bit later as well. Yeah. But Gulf War. Yeah, they didn't do well. No Soviet tanks did well in the Gulf War. I would argue that the issue was one overmatch with the better armour that had come in on the M1 Abrams and the Challenger, but air superiority.
I was about to say air superiority is the big thing.
That's
what's making the difference in Ukraine these days. Is if you don't have air superiority, you just stuffed.
Your tanks are in trouble.
Yeah.
There was also things in the Iraq War though. There were times when particularly Marines still using the M60s. Wandered into Iraqi formations, and the Iraqis got the first shots off, but still got obliterated, minimal losses to the American forces, and that was where just the targeting systems being so much better were really coming into it. But okay, the Tajikistani Civil War, Rob, tell us more about this.
obviously after 91, the fall of the Soviet Union, Tajikistan was figuring out who's going to be in charge, and some emir or sultan or fully duly elected government came into power. Didn't get into that too much. 1994, the Yemeni civil war, which seems to have still be going these days. I don't know if there was a difference between that civil war and the one that's happening at the moment, but
I think it's part of this continuum there. But
Yeah.
and then the Chechen War, where it at least didn't run out of fuel because the crews didn't just leave the engine, the turbine burning away.
It wasn't part of the. It was part of the local forces in the First Chechen War. It wasn't the main Russian forces that went into Grozny. Yeah, it wasn't part of the main Russian forces that went into Grozny. It was just part of the local MVD reserve units on the border that was basically keeping everything contained. So they didn't take a whole lot of losses there. Again, 98 to 2000, the Eritrean-Ethiopian War, because why not? They're still going. The 99 to 2009, the Second Chechen War, which is where the T-90s went in and kicked some butt. Again, it would have been the MVD's local forces keeping things contained rather than being involved in too much of the fighting. 2001 to 2021, war in Afghanistan, the Afghan government and the Taliban. All right, so
almost a really significant number of the pictures we've got to accompany this.
The one
was just on, yeah.
Just on.
Are Afghan T-62s, and there's a photographer in Afghanistan who's done a really good job of A, taking the photos, and B, publishing them to Wikimedia so anyone can use them. Just a quick hat tip as well to Vitaly Kuzmin, who is an absolute legend of photographing Soviet armor. He's a bit of a Russian nationalist, but we and everyone else who does anything involving tanks owes Vitaly Kuzmin a huge debt of thanks for the photos he's taken. Anyway.
Right. So the T-62s in Afghanistan, the paint job's changed a few times, but the T-62s are still working for whoever is in charge on the day. So yes, it might be the what are they? The Emir of Afghanistan, or the Republic of Afghanistan, or whichever else, or the returned.
I think it's the Islamic Republic now. Anyway.
No, it was the Islamic Republic when it was when yeah. Anyway. 2003, the invasion of Iraq. If there were any left over from Gulf War I, they got finished off in 2003. 2008, the Russo-Georgian Wars. Again, this is South Ossetia, Georgia, and Abkhazia, and a few other places. The first Libyan civil war, the Gaddafi government and anti-Gaddafi forces basically fighting it out, and whoever's special forces are going in and training up people to try and overthrow Gaddafi. 2011, the Syrian civil war. So the Syrian regime forces, ISIL and rebels. So basically the Syrian government under Assad had a bunch of them. They got a number of them got taken over by ISIL, or ISIS, or whoever you want to call them, plus other non-aligned rebels.
And the Kurds.
And with Russian supplying more to the Assad government forces recently. All right.
Although not since they invaded Ukraine and realised they were going to need all of them. So.
No, I don't know. But so another Libyan civil war, Libyan National Army and Government of National Accord. So again, they're getting more forces from the Tigray War, from the separatists within Ethiopia fighting the Ethiopian government.
I thought the Tigray War was still going, but I'm I don't want to get in a fight on that.
Yeah, supposedly they've handed their tanks back in 2022. So
okay,
yeah, all right.
Oh, so the war's ongoing, but the tanks aren't involved. Okay.
Well, I'm hoping the war is finished and the tanks have been handed back. So that's why. All right, and the Ukrainian war with the 2022. So yes, both sides are using those. All right, operators. In probably alphabetical order. All right. The communist-aligned government of Afghanistan ordered 100 T-62s in 1973, and then another 155 were delivered between 79 and 91. The Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, that's the Western-based after 2003. From 2004 they were up in the slideshow now being used by the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan. That's what I was talking about before.
Okay.
Yeah, so Islamic Emirate is what they
What
are now.
Emir is? You don't see him mentioned too often. No? All
right. Algeria had 330 delivered between 1977 and 1979, 290 still in service. Angola during the Civil War, 175 were delivered between 81 and 85. And then another 135 between 87 and 88. Another 24 were delivered from Bulgaria. So Bulgaria had their own rather than the Soviets in 93, along with a further 30 from Russia at the same time. Supposedly they still have 50 in service as of 2023. Cuba got 400 from the Soviets in the 70s and 80s, and most are still in service and upgraded to the T-62M version, which we'll get onto later.
The variants,
the versions, the models, the variants. You got to look forward to that, people. All right, Egypt 750 delivered from 72 to 75. Presently, 200 still in service with 300 in storage. Now we'll get on to the Egyptian ones because they have taken care. They like their T-62s better than anybody else. So anyway, Ethiopia, 20 delivered in 77, another 50 in 80. They were still in use in 2005, but who knows what's happening in nowadays. So it's all a bit of a, Iran, 65 purchased from Libya in 81. Another 100 from Syria in 82, plus 150 North Korean Chonmahos. I'm going to say, as I say, I only speak foreign badly. So in 81, at least 75 still seen in parades around the country. So they're still using them. Kurdistan region, Peshmerga forces operate a number of captured T-62s, up to 130. Libya, 900 delivered between 1974 and 78. Before the fall of Gaddafi's regime, 100 were still in service and 70 were stored. In 2020, Libyan National Army purchased more T-62Ms and MVs from the Russians. So before they went to the Russians started saying, "Oh, we can't sell any more of these. We need them. We need them all." Yeah. North Korea, because one of the few places said that they bought 500 between 71 and 78. But they also got the license to produce their own, and so they produced more than 1,200 Chonmahos of various versions. They had 1,800 T-62s and Chonmahos in 2005. Unknown how many more or less are still in service. They could have built more. They could have retired some.
Look, the sweet thing about North Korea is that because they don't have any food, but they can produce amphetamines. Everyone just gets amphetamines around the clock.
I have not heard that.
Yeah. And that's why they feel better about not being able to eat. But they're banging away in that factory, just knocking out T-62s with a bucket of ice. So worse things could happen.
All right, Russia. So after the fall of the Soviets, somewhere between 2,000 and 6,000 were sitting around at the fall of the Soviet Union, but only 761 were actually in active service in 1991. 191 were in active service and supposedly 1,900 in storage in 2000. I think those numbers are a bit low, but I think there's plenty more sitting around.
Bit low and weirdly precise.
Yeah. All right. During 2013, all the tanks of the model and its modifications were allegedly scrapped. I think there's some bad bookkeeping there.
It's not a status of forces in Europe dodge or something going on?
No, because they are all stored in Siberia, and so they're outside of the conflict area.
Outside of the European treaty zone.
Zone. So that's why they have everything in Siberia. So it's out of the CFE zone. So the CFE.
Conventional Forces Europe.
Yeah, that's the one. It was. Yeah. So by being outside there, they can store as many as they like, and it doesn't contravene the treaties that they signed in '94.
Okay.
And so they were allegedly scrapped, but later it was found that this was not true. What a surprise! As the Russians reactivated numerous T-62s to resupply the Syrian army. In 2022, the Russians sent T-62s to reinforce the southern Ukraine offensive in Zaporizhzhia Oblast, with supposedly 600 taken out of long-term storage.
And in fact, at this point, as far as we can tell, they're just pulling them out of storage. Tasman made a point that they prefer upgrading the T-62s because the autoloader's less finicky.
Yeah, it's much simpler. It's got to drill, and you're dealing with steel hulls, so all you're doing is putting holes in steel armour for when you want to install your fire control systems, your thermal sights and everything else. It's a case of you're not mucking around with composite armour that you have to worry about.
Yeah, you don't want to drill a hole in composite armour because those ceramic plates aren't going to appreciate that.
Nope,
but
no.
yeah.
It's, Anyway, Syria had 500 delivered between 73 and 74. 200 were delivered from Libya in 79, 300 more delivered from the Soviets in 82. In 2018, the Russians sent more reactivated T-62s to help prop up the Assad government. Tajikistan had 7.
7?
Yep,
right.
7. Well, why not? They probably got lots of others we've covered in other countries. Ukraine, they had 400 from the Soviets in 91, and they scrapped them. They said, yeah, you know what, we've got 80s.
We're not going to be fighting tank battles in the future. It'll be fine.
They scrapped them. But but since the invasion in 2022, they have captured a number of T-62s and are modifying them for use, mainly as armoured recovery vehicles or infantry fighting vehicles. Uzbekistan has 170. Vietnam still has 70 of theirs as of 2023. Yemen, they had 200 in 2005. Unknown how many remain in service on which side of the civil war they're fighting these days.
Look, at this point, people criticise me for saying this, but the Houthis are pretty much running Yemen. But anyway, look, in terms of former operators, Belarus had 170. Bulgaria took 250. And they had an interesting ARV version, which is in the slideshow. Eritrea received a number from Ethiopia. That's a nice way to say captured them.
Well, when the two countries split, they probably said when Ethiopia split and Eritrea gained independence, they said, right, rather than you may as well keep those ones.
Yeah, I don't think that was done with goodwill though. But yeah, okay. Iraq had 700, but don't operate them anymore. And then 2150.
Yeah, Saddam liked his tanks. He bought about over 3,000 of them. 500 were estimated to be in service in the 2003 invasion of Iraq, but I don't think many more of them are there. Israel, between 70 and 100 in reserve or training vehicles as of 2005.
The Terrans, which is a lovely name for a tank, but yeah.
Kazakhstan had 280, whether or not they're still going, who knows. Mongolia had 100, ordered in 73, and the Soviets and delivered between 73 and 75. We've done the Soviets.
Soviet Union as a former operator is okay. It's a bit cute, but all right.
I've only got so much time, mate. As I said, this is where we say the Tigray forces surrendered theirs to the Ethiopians after the civil war there. China, they've only got the one evaluation. This was only for the evaluation. They've got their one they captured, used for study only. The Czechs.
I feel better that we've got it in the slideshow. The only Chinese T-62. That's
they're
nice.
very proud of it. Yeah, they're very proud of it. The Czechs they evaluated it and said, "No, we're not going to build that. We're going to stick with the T-55s." US they got they bought 20 from the Israelis in the 70s for evaluation and study.
And they used them at Fort Irwin. We do have a picture of one in there.
Yeah, they also converted the troop maybe 14 as to be used as the Op-4 at Fort Irwin, which, from what I read. If they'd gotten them in the 70s, Fort Irwin was only set up in 1980-81 as the Op-4 training ground. So so there are photos of them listed in 88 for the T-62s running around. But we also know that the Sheridans were running around that time as Op-4 prior to Gulf War 1. So, all right. Anyway, so check out the Chieftain series on the 11th Armoured Cavalry Regiment at Fort Irwin, which is coming out each week at the moment. So,
also our interview with Steve Matthews, who was an Op-4 commander in a Sheridan.
And the Sheridans. But so anyway, the Chieftain's videos are coming out at the moment. And I'm sure if you're watching this, you're probably watching that as well. So, but we just want to call it out.
Just quickly, Tactical Gentleman from the Netherlands has joined us. So that's lovely.
Welcome.
Thank you for coming. Yes, and Alan reckons Fort Irwin had a great deal more than Tristan. Okay. Okay.
I'm not sure what that means.
Let's keep going.
Yeah, right. Now, what we've all
The
been waiting for.
variants. Here we
No,
go.
the models. No, these are the models. These aren't the variants. The variants
No.
come later.
Okay,
These are the
right.
models.
Okay.
All right. The T-62A, the predecessor of the T-62, a stretched T-55 chassis with a larger larger turret ring.
Still a 100mm gun, which
100
hasn't been asked about that earlier.
Yep.
So yeah, there were early run T-62s that only had a 100mm rifle gun, but yeah.
Only 5 entered service. All right, the original T-62 equipped with the 115mm gun, K version with a command version with better radios and less ammo, and a small auxiliary generator to run the radio, so without the engine going.
Which is weird that they thought this was something worth doing then and then didn't put an auxiliary power unit in the T-80. But there you go.
I bet the command versions of the T-80s had them.
Maybe. No.
Anyway.
All right. Yep.
All right, Object 167. They had a better 700 horsepower engine and 83 Saga ATGM launchers produced.
Worth noting that all of the T-62s could fire a barrel-launched
only
missile,
later. That came later.
It did, but the barrel the Soviets never built enough of the missiles for them to actually be that.
No, but
the
T-62 wasn't built with that ability in mind.
Yeah.
It just they realized that when they were doing the T-64 that they could do it.
Once you've got a smooth bore, you can put anything down that tube. Yeah.
So only 2 prototypes were built of that one. T-62 Object 1967, a standard T-62 with a modified engine deck and deep weighting system. In 72, the external machine 50 cal anti-aircraft gun was installed as standard on the Lotus hatch,
which did mess up the beautiful spherical geometry of the turret. It was quite an extra lump on the top to fit that. 12.7 sounds like it's a 50 cal, which is a 12.6, but it's a much bigger gun than Radius. These things are big. Yeah.
All right. The Object 1975 version added a laser rangefinder and an armored box over the main gun. 83, they added the Drozd active protection system, the APS.
And I'm not sure I'd call that an APS, but anyway.
That's what they call it. And BDD applique armor, extra simple composite armor, plates on the front glasses, and a new V55U diesel engine. The T-62M, which is in 1983, which M stands for modern, which is extensive modernization of the T-62 with protection and mobility improvements, belly armor plates for anti-mine protection, which they found they needed in Afghanistan, 10mm rubber side skirts, and 10mm anti-neutron liners.
That's a nuclear war protection.
So which is Ronald Reagan. That's you kind of want that. And the BDD applique armor package on the glasses and the 2 horseshoe-shaped blocks on the front of the turret. The armor would be proof
horseshoe-shaped. That's a nice way to describe it. I was thinking they were like cheeks or But cool.
Should be proof against all 84mm and 90mm tank guns. So your 84mm Carl Gustavs and. I
mean, 90mm. You're going back to your American, the 48s and 47s.
Yeah, true. Yep. And 105 rounds at. Yes.
Yeah, because I mean, we were basically talking about the L7 gun being proof against, and with the L7 in the M60 was very much what the Russians were worried about being able to defeat. I'm really sorry for the British flag shaggers, but the Soviets literally noted that the British tanks were in insignificant numbers to worry about.
So basically, by having that, they were trying to. Take out all the activities of all those various things. They also improved they used the improved T-72 track links, removed the tank rider handrails. So you no longer have the ability to carry troops on the outside of your tank as they are hanging onto the tank rider handrails.
Okay, now one of our favourite things going back to the start of this podcast is tank telephones, which the T-62 did not have.
But
it did, at its introduction, have a comm link so that the tank riders could talk to the...
I didn't see that.
But obviously, when you take out the handrails, then that comlink becomes less useful. But
well, there you go. So anyway, because they took out the handrails because you know what, infantry riding on your tank and ERA does not mix.
But they also had the BMP by this point, so the tank riders were now in their own vehicle. It wasn't 1944 anymore,
or 2024 when the Russians are still riding on the outside of the tanks.
No one wants to walk, okay?
All right. They installed the Volna fire control system with improved laser rangefinder and gunners and new gunner and commander's sights, ballistic computer, and the Stabber ATGM, not the Saga, the Stabber, with improved sights, night sight and ATGM launcher.
I just want to quickly, Tasman's made a really good point in terms of differentiating this tank from the T-55s. And he's correct in that the gaps in the road wheels are at the back in the 62s, and they're at the front in the 55s. But the other one is that the bore extractor is much closer to the front of the muzzle.
On
the 62. That's your easiest recognition.
But we'll get into this later on. But when you see a T-62 in movies and the bore extractor is right up beside the turret, that's when you know it's actually a Tehran, and they've used it's a 105 L7 gun in there because the bore extractor is right up beside the turret rather than halfway down the barrel. Anyway,
it's a bit further than halfway in the 62. But anyway, yeah.
Okay. But the point being is that there are photos online of the movie T-62s that you're saying. If you look at it now and say that's not a T-62, that's the bore extraction is in the wrong place. Anyway, that's because it's an L7. Anyway, they added a thermal gun sleeve, new radios, better engine with 620 horsepower, 2 extra rounds of ammo, and 2 sets of 4 grenade launchers on the rear. So this is the big upgrade. This was now. I just want to say, yes, I have gone through a number of variants and models just now, but between 73 and 85, there were another 12 at least listed as M's and or -1 or -2 or 1-2 or -2-1.
You're saying you could have been a lot more boring.
I could have been a lot more boring.
Wow.
Or T's or possibly D's, and each adding armour in different places and changing the engine or adding DROS to APS or an older version that didn't have it, and that's enough of that. And there's enough of that.
Yeah.
All right. I'm not going to bother.
This has gone on for quite some time. It's gone on for over an hour already. This is going to be a long one.
In 85,
we've got a lot to talk about in the second half as well.
Invasion of New York. Yeah, anyway. 1985, the T-62 MV, which is the first version fitted with Contact 1 ERA, replacing the BDD applique armour. And now we have the latest upgraded version with thermal sights for the commander and gunner and improved fire control system and electronics, and still a manually loaded 115mm gun. That was the models. Now we get on to the
variants.
All right, they experimented with a Zalud autoloader. That didn't work out. They experimented with a 120mm combat engineering vehicle with a 122mm howitzer, and another version with a combat engineering vehicle with a 160mm mortar.
That sounds like a useful sort of weapon. That could make people's lives miserable. But anyway, yep.
T-67 with a 125mm tank gun. They
tried T-72 at that point, isn't it?
They tried it out. The TOS 62 flamethrower tank only has a range of 100 meters, so actually a flamethrower rather than a flamethrower.
The thermobaric gun. Yeah. But 100-meter range on a flamethrower, which is pretty good.
And it was coaxially mounted with 115, so the normal main gun, so you could have both. All right, the IT-1 rocket tank destroyer, developed between 57 and 62. The turret was a flattened dome with a stabilized ATGM system. It could launch radio-guided Dragon ATGMs with a range between 300 and 3,000 meters, 3,300 meters. So basically, it's a rocket tank destroyer. They carried 12 in the autoloader and 3 spare. The ATGM was launched from an arm rising through the roof of the turret. 60 of these were built between 68 and 70. but they were disbanded after the withdrawal of the IT-1 and all vehicles converted to armoured recovery vehicles.
That sounds much more useful. Yeah.
They also had a number of them converted to tractor versions of them, and basically all converted to ARVs. They were not very successful and more of them were converted to armoured recovery vehicles. The armoured recovery vehicles versions of them were fitted with a stowage basket, a hoist, and a small crane with a capacity of 3 tons, and a winch and a snorkel. The Impulse 2M, which was a decommissioned T-62 tank converted into a firefighting vehicle fitted with a 50-round launch system for flame-retarding projectiles on a rotatable mount in the turret ring and a dozer blade on the front. That sounds fun, doesn't it? There's a firing.
Sounds like a useful vehicle.
Yeah, well, we'll get onto that. After the fall of the USSR, Russia had the following T-62M Object 2021, which is what we're seeing nowadays, which is the upgraded T-62M with Contact 1 ERA bricks and slat armour were added to the sides. More modern gunner sight replaced the older sights. The MV used an improved gunner sight and this is part of what's used in the Russian invasion of Ukraine at the moment. Algeria. They didn't like their 300 T-62s compared to the T-55s they had, as they had upgraded programs for the T-55s, but they left their T-62s out to dry. However, they have recently unveiled the BMP T-62, the Algerian Terminator, an IFV made from reconditioned but not upgraded T-62 hulls. So it's still got the steel hull, but they've whacked on top of it a Berezovsk turrets, which is a modern infantry fighting vehicle turret with 30mm autocannon, ATGM pods, automatic grenade launchers, modern fire control system and optics. And the vehicle was presented at the 60th anniversary of the Algeria's Independence Day in 2022.
Which would have been a big deal for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. I mean, 60 years for bloody kicking the French out and saying, hey, we are no longer going to fight your foreign wars. We're going to fight our own. Bulgaria had, they converted theirs into armoured recovery vehicles. Keep going. And they also had the TP-62, which converted into a firefighting vehicle, which was used in 2012 in the Vitosha mountain bushfires near the capital of Sofia. And maybe we could have had those some around for Canberra during 2003 and 2020 when the city was burning around us.
I think some armoured firefighting vehicles would
be awesome.
I'm all in favour.
Rather than seeing
if a candidate puts that on their platform, I'm voting for them in October.
Seeing the flames coming up over the hills towards Canberra in 2003 and 22 and 20, and you just go in the smoke, everything. We're saying, well, if the Bulgarians can do it for Sofia, why can't we do it for Canberra?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, no, I don't think our bridges are that well.
Yeah,
they might be able to take a
40-ton vehicle.
The 30-ton vehicle without the turret and the gun. Yeah, they might actually be able. That might be the only thing we can actually take.
All right, let's get rolling because I need to wee at some point. But,
all right, Egypt. They seem to be the only country that actually has like their T-62, so they
really love them.
Yeah, they keep putting. They keep making them as modern as they can. They introduced an Austrian firm, Noricum, replacing the 100. In the 80s, started replacing the 115mm tank gun with the L7, 105mm rifle gun. And then later in the 90s, they built 105mm M68 tank guns. I'm not sure what that is, but I'm assuming it's a non-rifle version. So this Noricum company, they built the RO115 Mark 1 version for Egypt, which was a British. They put in a British diesel 750 horsepower engine, ballistic computer, fire control system, laser rangefinder, explosive reactive armor, and increased the weight up to 43 tons. In the 1990s, the same company did the T-62E Mark II, where they introduced the 105mm M68 tank gun, German 880 horsepower engine, and
that would have been a big upgrade.
And NBC protection, armoured side skirts, external ATGM launchers, increasing the weight up to 45 tons.
I'm wondering what the Egyptians thought was going to happen to require that NBC protetion, which I suspect means war with Israel.
Yeah.
But wow, that's interesting.
Then in 2004, they went to 120mm Mark III smoothbore gun with an 890 horsepower German diesel engine, more armour, increasing the weight up to 46.5 tonnes. Now, 2010, Ukraine was developing upgrade kits for the T-62 known as T-62 AG and T-62 AGM. These are modular kits that could be sold separately and installed either in Ukraine or on site. Unfortunately, they couldn't get any buyers except Egypt in 2010. However, they had the Arab Spring and the orders were cancelled. They didn't manage to sell, the Ukrainians didn't manage to sell any further than that. The kits included 120 or 125 mil smoothbore guns, upgrades, 850 or 1,050 horsepower diesel engines, new transmissions, 70k kilometers an hour forward and 30 kilometers an hour in reverse.
That's a huge upgrade.
I know,
Yeah.
but nobody bought it. More ERA, soft kill active protection, thermal imaging, improved fire control system, safer flat carousel autoloader, an autoloader in it, and
that's a different tank at that point.
But these are all modular things. You can say, I want that bit. I want 3, 4, 5, and 7. Bustle ammo storage, improved engine deck, protection from flaming liquids, which when you think about Molotovs, and napalm.
Now, we've got someone called Ramen Noodle Packets asking how do the Afghans feel about theirs. And I would say the Afghans are pretty keen, given that they seem to have been using them for a long time and they get photographed on important occasions.
France didn't have any T-62s, but that didn't stop them coming up with a modernisation package for them to install a 120mm French gun and all the other stuff.
I'd say the thermal imager was what the French were really offering there, because they have really good fire control systems.
But no one wanted to buy them. Israel. Israel captured at least 132 from Egypt and Syria during the 73 Yom Kippur War, converted them to meet their requirements in the Tehran 6. They tried to attach a travel box to the end of the rear of the turret.
When you say gearbox, we think attach the engine.
Sorry,
right.
I'm thinking about actually gear
an equipment
in a box, an equipment box. The rear of the turret, but which was then obstructed by the hatch for the automatic cartridge case ejection system. And maybe this is why when they gave/sold them to the US for evaluation, the story goes that when the tank was fired, the shell casings were ejected onto the closed ejection hatch or port, and then bounced around the fighting compartment as the trigger to open the ejection port had been removed by the Israelis. It was sitting on the floor of the turret, unnoticed.
The floor of the turret's worth talking about, because in our T-55 episode, which was in the distant past, we talked to a T-55 operator and we got confused with him on the subject of turret baskets. And look, what I've now figured out is that basically they had a fixed turret floor.
Something's just
there we go. They had a fixed turret floor, but not a basket. Is the thing to understand there. And there are reasons why a basket can be good, because you don't have people having their arms removed as the turret swings around, but it does constrain your internal volume, which there's not a lot to go around in these Russian tanks.
Right. The Israelis, the original 115mm gun was retained, unlike the Tehran 4 and 5, which was the T-54-55 version, which had the L7 105mm rifled gun installed, making the IDF dependent on capturing ammunition for the T-62s.
See, I don't believe that's such an issue anymore, because now we know that people in warehouses in northern Syria working for the Kurds can make tank ammunition. So Israel can make their own T-62 ammunition.
Well, while we're talking about with the Romanian tank, is that the Israelis were providing 100mm rifled rounds. Tehran 6 was apparently the only deployed operationally during the 82 invasion of Lebanon, and was withdrawn from service shortly afterwards as the arrival of further stocks of M60 tanks from the US made it unnecessary to use a T-62. North Korea bought a number of T-62s from the Soviets and then was the only country to get a license to build them further. The Chonma-ho 1, this is a lighter and thinner armoured copy of the T-62. The Chonma-ho 2, which is the Soviet purchase versions. Chonma-ho 3 as per the 2 but with upgrades. Chonma-ho 4, which had the composite armour upgrades. Fire control system, gun stabilization, 750 horsepower engine, ERA mountings, no composite armor, smoke grenade. Where there was no composite armor, they put it on ERA. Smoke grenade launchers facing backwards so you can reverse through the smoke.
Just a quick question from the floor. So Ramen Noodle Packet's asking about the ammo being generated. They were definitely recycling the brass cartridges. I'm just talking about T-55 ammunition in the Syrian civil war. Our interview subject was telling us that they had to keep the brass, and then that was getting repacked. But, yeah.
All right. The Chonmo Ho 5, which introduced a 125mm gun, better ballistic computer, thermal imager, T-72, T-90 armour packages, possible but unlikely to have gotten rid of the introduced an autoloader, and they got rid of the spent shell ejection system. Ukraine, besides the upgrade package developed in 2010, they tried and failed to sell to the export market. They also have, from the captured vehicles they've gotten from Russia, they've heavy infantry fighting vehicle, armoured recovery vehicle, an armoured bridge layer. They also, some volunteers whacked on a BMP-2 turret with armour plates and an ERA, and we're trying to call it a heavy infantry fighting vehicle. All right, Legacy. I think we'll come back to Legacy after the break.
No.
Okay.
Let's keep going.
All right, so Legacy.
Let's swag it through.
Okay, Legacy does not make it into Girls on Panzer. This is important, boys and girls. But does appear in a few other movies. Before 1991, any real Soviet tanks were usually depicted by the Israeli Tyrans 4 and 5. We're thinking Rambo 3 and The Beast being both those movies. After then, until 2012, there were actual T-62s to use as background tanks, but no English-speaking, as far as I can tell, movies that prominently featured a T-62. Maybe Charlie Wilson's War for Afghanistan, but otherwise I haven't really seen them. World of Tanks. World War II version has the original T-62A with a 100mm gun as a Tier 10 Russian medium. It's still, I have that one, and it's still fun to gun and run around the place.
Now, we did have one of our social media followers comment about how much they love playing the T-62 in War Thunder as well.
Oh, good.
But yeah.
All right. Now, my thoughts on the tank were it's a real stopgap of a tank. The T-55 was being built and exported by the thousands. The all-singing, all-dancing T-64 with a 125mm gun, composite armour, autoloader was on the way. But there was that slight gap in 1961 between when the M60 came out and the Soviets needed a bigger gun. And the right people were on board to give it the go-ahead at the right time. And for the next 14 years, 22,000 T-62s were built and formed 75% of the Soviet tank forces. It's the fourth most produced tank in the world, as I said before, behind the T-55, T-34, M4 Sherman. It's simple enough for conscripts to operate and maintain, and slightly better than the T-55 and less complex than the T-64, 72, and 80s and 90s. It's a tank that has been damned by faint praise all its life, but it's still going and still filling the gaps of giving the Russians more barrels on the front lines, usually with indirect fire, with thermal imaging and a stockpile of 115mm ammo that hasn't been sold off on the black market, as there's fewer discrete customers for all the parts.
I would just note that it is absolutely seminal in tank history because it was the first tank with a smoothbore cannon using APF SDS, and it invalidated every steel armored tank in the world at that time. So the British Chieftain became an embarrassing wrong turn. The American M60 became functionally useless, and the M1 Abrams had to be quite rushed to replace it. It is enormously significant, but it does not have that cachet that it frankly deserves. Even though, yes, aside from the gun, it really is just a marginal upgrade to the T-55.
But yeah, so as I said, it's damned by faint praise, but it's still filled the gap every time.
The poll, Rob, where are we up to?
My goodness.
17 votes, a bit meh on 41% and transformative on 59%. So we'll let you know where we end up on that poll by the end. But now we have the halftime break, Rob, and we have a really fascinating interview with listener Martin, who has an interesting story about an early First World War tank battle, and then we have a mystery that we want our audience to help us solve.
We'd love that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right.
All right, let's go. So joining us now is Martin Horton Edison, who's a lecturer in strategic studies at Cardiff University, and is working on a book about a tank battle, and he's got, he's here to talk to us about it. Martin, hello. Thank you for joining the show.
Gentlemen, real pleasure. Thank you for having me on.
So tell us about this battle you're writing a book about.
Right. Okay. So I kind of can't decide on the title of the book, whether I call it the Forgotten Battle or the Battle of whatever we decide it's going to be called. But essentially, listeners will know that 1918 was the final year of the First World War, that there was a role to play for tanks in that final year, and that probably the Australians, alongside the Canadians, dealt one of the hardest punches right in the middle of German Second Army in and around the Somme Valley. But this battle has been somewhat forgotten to history, partly, I think, because the British saw it as an Australian battle, and criticism of British generals at the time meant that they weren't that keen on talking about Australian general successes. This is a General Monash battle. And the Australians saw it as an Australian battle until they started digging into it and realised that actually half the troops were British, the tanks were crewed by British, what was normally the Australian air squadron wasn't available that day, so it was British Air as well. So it became a bit muddy, and as a result, I think the combination of those political reasons and also that events moved on fairly rapidly after that, the battle has been forgotten. But
now
just to,
we're talking about
Rob.
We're talking about the Battle of Plateau Wood at the end of August 1918.
Yeah, that's right, Rob. Sometimes it's called Plateau Wood, sometimes it's called Chouignol Valley, sometimes it's called Chouigné Valley, because the two villages ridiculously closely named, bloody French. And sometimes it's called Eurleville Woods, sometimes it's called Eurleville, and sometimes it's just described as east of Proyart or before Peronne. So it suffers from a lack of clear nomenclature, and that's partly because the British decided what battles were called sometime after the war, and it sort of slipped through the net. So officially, it's the third battle of the Somme, Battle of Albert, but Albert is way north of the river. And the key thing about this battle is that the Somme at this point, from Amiens to Saint-Quentin, runs west-east or east-west on an almost horizontal plane, and then somewhere sort of 10 miles east of Eurleville, it takes a 90-degree southerly turn. And the Germans, Ludendorff himself, the German commander, said, look, we don't want to be pushed over that southerly turn of the Somme. We're going to hold out as long as we possibly can whilst we fortify our defences on the other side of on the other side of that Great Bend. And at the same time, the British effort moved further north, but Monash, as part of the commander of the Australian Corps, thought, well, hang on a minute, I can sense that the Germans are in trouble here. Maybe if I just give them one hard shove, I can, in fact, find myself on the west bank of that turn of the Somme and make things really difficult for the Second Army at that time of the war. So that's indeed exactly what he decided to do. And listeners who are aware of the Battle of Hamel in 4th of July will know that Monash had a thing about saving lives. Good on him. And he also, as an engineer, really liked using machines. And there's a wider debate at this time in the sort of senior political and general circles about whether wars should be won by meat or machines. Rawlinson, commander of 4th Army, under whom Monash's Australian Corps is serving, initially is a skeptic about machines. But after Hamel, the Australian success there kind of won him over. And so at Hamel, 4th of July, 1918, 60 tanks, a couple of divisions of Australian troops, with a few companies of Americans. 4th of July, first time Americans had ever fought under foreign generalship, went in on a 90-minute plan. Monash had this 90-minute plan, and it was essentially the first proper combined arms, tactical combined arms operation of the First World War, by which I mean he had aerial resupply of forward line troops. You had artillery using aircraft as spotters. You had tanks, you had infantry, trench mortars, rifle grenades, and bayonets. He decided the battle would last 90 minutes. All objectives were achieved in 93 minutes. And I think Monash was probably slightly annoyed by that 3 minute.
No, he would have been very annoyed.
And Rawlinson, your commander of Fourth Army, is completely won over. At this point now, there's a pause. And there's some sort of regrouping happens. Haig looks at his map and says, hang on a minute, German spring offensive pushed themselves a little bit too close to Amiens for our liking. And Amiens is this great logistical hub of rail and road, really crucial to the Allies. The Germans were checked in the spring by the Australians at Villers-Bretonneux. And Villers-Bretonneux is on this horizontal Roman road that runs directly underneath that west-east span of the Somme we were talking about earlier. And so they say, right, let's do Hamel again, but on a much grander scale. And initially, the Battle of Amiens, 8th of August 18, is designed as just a big raid. But 600 armoured vehicles of various different descriptions, the entire unified Australian Corps, first time the Australian Corps had fought as a unified unit on the Western Front, Canadian cousins, and some British divisions, 19 divisions of the BEF, hit the Germans so hard that Ludendorff described it fairly famously as the Black Day of the German army. 30,000 Germans.
Australians know that very well, but yeah.
Yeah, there you go. So this is the thing. So this is the kind of big brother of Eurleville. So this is kind of important because, so if you imagine Hamel as the dry run, Amiens as the big monster hit, Amiens kind of peters out after a couple of 3 days. It turns out that Edwardian machines aren't great at being pushed really hard for day after day after day into battle. And so those sort of 600 armoured vehicles start to dwindle down to the really low hundreds by about the 12th, 13th of August. And so they call it quits and say, right, that'll do. Marshal Foch is like, come on, push on more. The Canadians say to Haig, look, we are done. And Monash says, yeah, we've just got to pause here. So there's this pause. The next thing that appears in the historiography of the First World War, largely south of the Somme, is that the Australians then, screaming like bush rangers, run up Mont Saint-Quentin, take that south bend of the Somme, and that's kind of how the historiography moves on. Problem is, there's a fortnight in the middle there where there's about 12 miles of advance, which kind of gets forgotten, and it's in that Eurleville happens, and it's almost a mirror image of Hamel. So you have kind of Hamel at 60 tanks, Amiens at 600 tanks, and then Eurleville is 36 fighting tanks and a small amount of supply tanks, which are used to bring engineering material and ammunition up to the front. But the Germans have decided that they are going to hold on here. So they've reinforced with several divisions. There's 10 different German battalions in the line south of the Somme. The Australians don't really know what they're going to find. There's no kind of time for excessive reconnoitering and so forth. They're all given 36 hours notice. The 1st Division is brought in. They haven't fought with tanks before. And underneath them, there's a British division, which is why the Aussies don't like talking about this battle very much, who actually take the village of Eurleville. And they are essentially the Salford Pals of 1916 fame, augmented by some really angry Glaswegians. And there's some quite fun tales in the German accounts of this battle. Of men in skirts running at them and stabbing them with bayonets and things, really quite gruesome.
From hell. Yep.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Exactly it. In fact, the German Air Force, when you look at their accounts, say we know they don't have a word for kilt in German, so it translates as short skirt. So reading the accounts of these men in short skirts advancing over there, it's quite amusing in itself. So we have this battle. Now, in the middle of the battle, so here's the key thing. The reason the Germans decide to hold out here is that the Somme has a number of tributary valleys, and the Chouinier Valley, at the top of which is Chouinier, the village, at the bottom of which is Eurleville, is the largest dry valley south of the Somme, anywhere between Amiens and that big turn in the bend at Peronne-Saint-Quentin. So the Germans fortify this valley. It's heavily wooded on both sides. They bring in hundreds of machine guns. There's no time to really entrench, but what they do is link up shell scrapes, deploy existing old French trench networks, whatever they can do to kind of reinforce this. And they bring forward field artillery in horizontal depression with the expectation that tanks are going to come. And they also work out that Minenwerfers or mortars fired on the horizontal are also pretty effective anti-tank weapons.
That's interesting. I hadn't heard that before.
Piercing. Go for it. Sorry, you've not heard. Yeah, well, this is all new, you see. This is the problem with forgetting battles. The other thing is that some experimental heavy machine guns with armour-piercing ammunition are brought forward as well. And they lay out lanes where they expect tanks to come to put anti-tank mines in. They never arrive because of the logistical problems that the Germans are experiencing at this time. But they do manage to put wild boar traps in the woods. Sort of old mechanical medieval wild boar traps in the woods. This is gruesome stuff. The key thing is that this area, by fluke of fate, is almost virgin. There are a few artillery holes knocking around. East of the valley is the old French battlefields of the Somme 1916. West of it is this great sloping plateau that runs to the dry riverbed. And that dry riverbed, by the way, in 1940, the Wehrmacht bring their tanks down said dry riverbed to take Eurleville, and there's a battle there, and that's another book. But at this time, you've got this big, long, sloping piece of ground, almost unmolested by artillery fire, and Monash says this is tank country. This is exactly what we need. We've got dwindling tank resources, but now is the time to deploy them. So he sends 12 tanks with the 32nd Division in the south, there to get them into Eurleville and east of the village, after which a couple are to stay around while they dig in, and the rest are to go further north to help the Aussies. The Aussies themselves from the beginning have got 2 lots of 12 in the kind of middle in the heavily wooded area around the Roman road, and another 12 north of that Roman road between the road and the river to get them onto objectives there as well. So this is all set up to be, this is semi-open warfare. This is semi-open warfare. And in that sense, this is an interesting battle because really it's the first time where, probably the first time where tanks are used where the enemy's dispositions are unknown or relatively unknown. And they've learned the lessons of Hamel. At Hamel, they found that the tanks were too far behind the infantry. At Amiens, that lesson was underscored. So by the time they get to Eurleville, they say tanks and infantry go up together. It's a symbiotic protective relationship. Tanks protect infantry, infantry protect tanks. And so they go in, almost line abreast. It's certainly in the south. They have to wait a little bit for tanks up further north. And they come in through, they use artificial fog. It's foggy morning anyway, 04:45 in the morning in late August in France, is particularly in the Somme Valley, is quite often
It's misty.
a difficult visual environment. Yeah. So they put artificial fog. 20% of artillery is smoke shell, and they screen the north bank of the Somme entirely with smoke. So the German artillery on the other bank can't do anything about what's happening here. It's interesting to read the tank commander's reports afterwards saying they couldn't see what the hell they were doing. Less smoke next time, please. But the German accounts are they're on us before we even realise where they are. And, the Australians at this time in the war were known as vigorous bayonet fighters. The combination of an angry digger backed up by Glaswegians in skirts and 36 Mark V fighting tanks coming through the mist at you meant that the Germans fought pretty hard. The machine gunners were told that their machine gun rounds would penetrate the front of the tank. Turns out, not so much. So they carried on firing until they were ran over by the tanks. I mean, the tanks physically had to sort of drive over these machine gun positions, and we're talking 20 or 30 occasions of that happening. And the tanks get to the valley. Now, originally, Monash's line, his kind of first phase objective line, is the middle of that dry valley, running north-south between Schwigney and Eurleville. But some of his subordinate commanders said it'd probably be a good idea if we extend that to the other side of the valley. So the tanks try and get up the valley side, and they find their horizontal depression mortars and field guns firing. At this point, a number of tanks are knocked out, and the Australians get forward. Now, in the middle of all of this, we have the man of the hour, a gentleman called Lance Corporal John Jack McAvoy. And McAvoy has already won the MM at Rosières on the 9th of August in one of those immediately after Amiens battles.
That's
He's
a military medal for those who don't know what an MM is.
Mhm.
And,
yeah, oh, so sorry. Yes,
and he's an Australian, not even though he's a McAvoy, he's not the Glaswegians.
That's right. Yeah, good point, Rob. Sorry. Yes, although a lot of these Australians, when you look at what the guys that died, you look at where they were born, a number of them are Scottish, but McAvoy is in fact an Australian, he's a Victorian, by which I mean in both senses of the word. He is born in the Victorian era. And
just because we do have a big American audience, it's worth pointing out that Australian citizenship did not exist until the 1950s. All of these soldiers were British subjects.
Absolutely right. When he signs up, in fact, it says, "What's your nationality?" And you know, he signs to say he's a British subject. But you know, I think he's probably a fairly proud Australian. He's from a fairly rural area, I think, a place called Jones Creek in Victoria. Now, I looked on Google Maps, and there are a number of Jones Creeks. Presumably, a number of people called Jones found creeks at some point when they were stealing Australia from the locals. So I wasn't entirely certain quite where that was, but let me just while we're on, I'm going to just bring up what I know about John. So the point of this is that during the course of the battle, the Aussies get stuck in some of these woods, and the tanks are either not there or doing something else at the time. And the important thing, as I'm sure the listeners will know, in battle is momentum, is keeping things moving forward. And McAvoy finds himself in a position where they're held up and he's got to do something about it. So he's originally slated for the Victoria Cross, which is, in modern parlance, to win the Victoria Cross in these days, you've got to almost be killed doing your act of bravery. It is very difficult to win a Victoria Cross, but McAvoy's originally recommended for it. So I think what I'll do, if it's okay with you chaps, yeah, all right. So in the middle of the whole battle area, there's these heavy woods, as I talked about, and it's absolutely crucial that they're taken because they open the door to getting into and out of this the deepest, more steep parts of this valley. So McAvoy's fighting with the 8th Battalion. The 8th Battalion originally are what in those days we called a support battalion. So the way it worked was you'd have a lead battalion that would hit the German front line. Any major obstacles that they found, in order to maintain momentum, they would go round those and leave it for the support battalions to mop up. And then you would have a reserve behind that if things started going wrong or you needed to commit more weight somewhere. So at the original battle plan, the Australian 6th AIF is the lead. They skirt round some of these machine guns and start keeping momentum. But it turns out that the Germans have got bunkers in some of these woods that nobody knew about. Also missing from the historiography, they are actually dug in under the woods in concrete bunkers. As soon as the 6th go past, they pop up, and the 8th find themselves having to deal with these redoubts behind the 6th line. During the course of that, they become held up, and at some point in this time, a gentleman called William Donovan Joint wins his Victoria Cross, which is awarded originally slated for a Distinguished Conduct Medal, which is one down, but he gets upgraded later. More on that in a moment. But so they need to take these positions out. There's not really much tank support, and our man McAvoy, who at Rosières found himself without tanks, found himself in a position where he had to fire his Lewis gun, which is a light machine gun, light by First World War standards. This is a crucial point. Right, these are heavy support weapons, but by this time in the war, they're being used essentially as assault rifles. The number of these Lewis guns in sections and platoons had sort of gone up exponentially throughout the course of this part of the war, and McAvoy is a Lewis gunner. So where we are now is, I'll read, in fact, what I'll do, if it's okay with you, is I'll read the citation. How's that? That makes a lot of sense.
Sounds good.
All right, so for conspicuous gallantry, skillful leadership, and fearless devotion to duty on the attack on Eurleville Wood on the 23rd of August 1918, this non-commissioned officer was in charge of a Lewis gun team. And when the leading battalion suffered heavy casualties, so that was the 6th, the companies diverged, leaving a dangerous gap. Corporal McAvoy on his own initiative, rushed his Lewis gun and team forward and saved a critical situation. His little party was subjected to an intense fire from enemy machine guns, from trench mortars and direct artillery fire. These are the artillery pieces that were brought in to protect against tanks. So he engaged the machine gun and by accurate shooting, exposing himself fearlessly to do so, put 3 enemy machine guns out of action, stopping the enemy enfilade fire on our line and allowing the advance to continue. Later, he worked forward with his Lewis, because if that wasn't enough, he hasn't just then gone back for a cup of tea or something. He's stayed in the line. And later, he works forward again with his Lewis gun, breaking down defensive machine gun posts and rushing a battalion headquarters, an enemy battalion headquarters, taking a large number of prisoners, including the battalion commander. He formed the prisoners up and marched them to the rear under their battalion commander to our own line. Returning again, he went forward, engaging all enemy machine guns that fired on his front, keeping down their firing, allowing our troops to push forward. In Plateau Wood, when a nest of enemy machine guns fought with stiff resistance, he outflanked the party and brought accurate fire to bear with his Lewis gun, killing and wounding a great many and causing the remainder of the garrison of about 40 to surrender. He set a magnificent example of courage, initiative and dash, and inspired all around him. He continued, and this is a key word here, his superhuman work until seriously wounded by shell fire in the head and arms. Now, at some point, he is then evacuated as a casualty because he's got this, it says shell wound in the citation, but his medical notes say gunshot wound to his right maxilla, which is the upper jaw area. Now, this I think is really crucial because we were talking before, gents, weren't we, about this is the birth of Australian nationalism, right? So as you quite rightly said, John, at the start of the war, Australians signed up as British subjects, but there are moves in Australia for proper or more closer to independence as Australia as a not just a nation but as a state, and part of that is constructing, much of it based in fact, but constructing this concept of the Anzac hero, the Australian digger, who is 6 foot tall, rural, tanned, a superior human being to his slightly sickly looking British counterparts.
They all have very lantern jaws as well. Yeah, there's here in Canberra there's a lot of statuary that just it's a certain type, and that's what they want. And I would argue Ben Robert Smith's Victoria Cross in Afghanistan was entirely related to fitting the shape. But, yeah.
Now, that's an interesting point, because if I can bring up a picture of William Donovan joint, the two, he and Robert Smith don't look too dissimilar, actually. They both conform to that, right? Whereas a man shot through the top of his jaw, possibly with a brain injury, is going to have... in fact, I was speaking to a doctor at a wedding about this. What fun wedding chat I am, just the other day. And I said, well, you know, kind of, how is that, what's that going to look like? And he said his face is going to be wrecked, right? Even if it's not open scarring, if it's gone in through the mouth, the top of the jaw is going to have collapsed, and that's going to have a real impact on his visual kind of appearance. So for that reason, it is my supposition that although he is originally recommended for the Victoria Cross, someone somewhere is thinking about parading these Victoria Cross heroes through the streets of Canberra and Sydney, and questioning whether a man with potential brain injury and facial disfigurement is going to fit in with that image of Australian masculinity or not. I don't know for sure, but what I do know is that he's recommended for the Victoria Cross, and then it's downgraded first to the DCM, then down to the military medal, or rather a bar, which means a second military medal compared to his first one at Rosier. And at the same time, old William Donovan Joint, I'm not saying he didn't earn his Victoria Cross, he almost certainly definitely did, is upgraded from a DCM to the Victoria Cross a couple of days after McAvoy is downgraded. And that's why I'm here, because this side of the world makes it really difficult for me to find records. Now, as far as I can tell, John Jack McAvoy, 6071, Lance Corporal John Jack McAvoy of Victoria, didn't have any children, but he did have a wife called Florrie. And Florrie I know that she accompanied him to go and collect a couple of his medals in 1921. Sorry. So he's evacuated and he gets returned to Australia on the Jaccardo, I think it's called, in 1919. She knows he's been injured. She doesn't know any details, as far as I can tell from the record. So she goes to pick up her lovely husband with his medals and everything from the boat and finds this man probably quite changed from the man that left in 1916. And she goes with him to collect his medal. So we know they're still kind of knocking around together at that point. Later on, throughout the 1919, 1920s and 1930s, at some point they become estranged. Why that is, I don't know. I should imagine living together was very difficult with his experiences and potentially with his injuries.
Yeah, I would guess he was in chronic pain, but...
I should think he was in chronic pain. And how do you treat chronic pain? How do you self-medicate chronic pain in those days?
Drink a lot of whiskey, yeah.
Drink a lot of whiskey. And certainly we know he's at some point in the 1930s, because his brother writes to the War Department or whatever you call it in Australia there and says, do you know where my brother is? He's probably drawing a pension. I'd really like to know where my brother is. And John Jack McAvoy's brother, Arthur McAvoy, is a sergeant in the police. And in fact, before the war, John Jack was a fireman. So they're a uniformed service, upstanding family. And he writes to the War Office, says, do you know where my brother is? And they say, well, the last address we had of him is at this place called Flinders Street in Sydney. And looking at it today, looking around that area, there's a lot of hostels. I wonder whether there's always been a lot of hostels there, whether that's the sort of place a returned veteran would hang out, you know. It's not far from Bondi Beach. You can imagine someone descending into drink and just kind of not liking themselves very much, kind of hiding out there. And then in 1939, he turns up at the War Office to collect his British Victory Medal, which hadn't been issued for whatever reason. Maybe because the war had broken out. This is November 39. Maybe he decides putting medals up might get him some sympathy or assistance, or he just wanted to go collect it. And after that, I find nothing. Can't find a death record for him. Can't find a burial for him. For me, is if there's a memory of him in the family, and it'd be through his brother Arthur McAvoy's children and grandchildren, it'll likely be of this war-injured man. Who maybe turned to drink, I don't know, who kind of was estranged and disappeared into the ether, sort of literally faded away. How and where and by whom he was buried, I don't know. And I think that's unfair, because this man, he's a hero. He should have been awarded the Victoria Cross. The injuries that blighted his life thereafter were sustained in an act of supreme heroism. And if we can, in some way, even if this is it, this podcast is it, that the name Lance Corporal John Jack McAvoy sticks in people's minds, then I feel as though we've done him a good service. But if, by some miracle, those people who want to have Monash posthumously awarded Field Marshal or whatever it is, that movement of people want to get behind John Jack McAvoy and maybe get his Victoria Cross awarded to him, or at least the family become aware of how Uncle Jack got to the condition he was in, then we will have done everybody, I think, a great service. So I appeal to your Australian listeners who may be able to help track down this man. So his brother was Sergeant Arthur McAvoy. He died, unfortunately, in 1941, 1942, quite suddenly. And he was a police officer at Willania, small outpost 500 clicks north of Victoria, sort of into the interior somewhere. And that's all we know. That's all I know. So anybody that can help, I presume they can contact you guys and they can forward that information on.
Yeah, no, get in touch with us. So that's totestank@gmail.com or through the our podcast website. We would love if any of the sleuths in our audience could track down more information. That would be a lot of fun for everyone and quite worthwhile. I got to say, I spent a year working at the War Memorial writing the On This Day social media posts. So I've done every Australian Victoria Cross. Read their citations and summarised them and. Reading it, it's like, there's a lot of these, taking a lot of machine gun posts, taking a lot of prisoners. He's not quite in the Sexton League, but I would definitely agree that there's a lot of other people who've been awarded Victoria Crosses who did less. So it's and we have started doing quite a bit of Australian revisionism. They gave who was it? Anyway, they finally awarded one to the Navy a couple of years ago, which was a big deal because the Royal Australian Navy had never had a Victoria Cross. So
it's not impossible. It's not.
No, it's entirely possible because the Victoria Cross for Australia is now a separate decoration awarded by Australian authorities. So they have actually started very slowly fixing some of these injustices.
It's quite interesting listening to you guys, but also there are, as you say, there's some Australian revisionist historians out there who are trying to kind of cut through the sort of nationalist hysteria of the time and really get a more accurate appraisal of how Australia fought in the First World War. And part of that is the kind of Gallipoli thing, which is massive. But the Australians lose more men after the time period that I'm talking about and before the end of the First World War than they did at Gallipoli. Like these men that I'm talking about now fought at Bullecourt, Pozières, Ypres. They were on the Somme for 2 years. These are experienced, battle-hardened soldiers. Some of them were at Gallipoli. Many, were at Gallipoli, but John Jack McAvoy was not, but he did do 2 years on the Somme. He entered France in sort of 1916. And I think part of that reappraisal of Australia in the First World War is a greater recognition of the sacrifice that was made in France, as well as the kind of Gallipoli Anzac thing going on.
Yeah, look, I would say on that, the issue is obviously Anzac Day is the national holiday, so that's the big one, and then that's the story that gets told. Amongst Australians who pay attention to military history, which is not everyone by any means, the Western Front, and particularly the 100 Days at the end of the war, is quite well known. But it's this particular little battle is heading to deeper obscure territory, though.
Yeah, it is quite obscure, and a lot of the source material. This is cool. You guys are going to love this, right? So I found during the 1920s, unsurprisingly, a lot of Germans didn't have much money, but what they did have was a bucket load of war stories. So you get these individual kind of, a lieutenant from a particular battalion writes the storied history of the battalion. A lot of it is absolute nonsense, but you can triangulate some facts from those. Problem is, it's in really poorly, kind of old Hochdeutsch, strange looking font. Often they were scanned in the 90s and dumped in a German archive somewhere. Really difficult to read. But AI, you can train it to read the font, can suddenly pick up whole pictures, transcribe and translate it. So I have this battle from 50 different German sources as well as the Allied sources, so it's going to be a real triangulation. And because it was 1 day, and it's a fairly small, we've got a 7,000-yard front here with 2 divisions up and the Germans in defence, we're going to be able to do this in a great deal of detail down to individual tanks. And the final point is that the Mark V tank in Bovington was involved in this battle. It was one of the tanks, the actual one. Yeah, so there you go. And also, in this battle, Ritter von Greim, the future head of the German Luftwaffe, this is the battle at which he claims he destroyed a tank from the air, the first air-to-ground tank destruction. But turns out, not true. Not true. The tank archives don't bear it out.
Which is absolutely classic of pilots claiming to have destroyed tanks that they did not. But yeah. yeah, I know. But it's interesting because I guess it kind of drove their determination that they would develop the Stuka and all that kind of thing. But it turned out, not true. Anyway, Rob needs to go. So I think Rob has just disappeared, but that's okay. We need to wind up, but it's been an absolute delight talking to you, Martin. And we hope that our listeners can find us some more information on this case.
It's been a real pleasure to be on the podcast. You guys are my constant companion on long journeys, and I've really enjoyed being on, and I hope I haven't taken up too much of your time.
No, that's been lovely. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Martin. And for anyone who knows how to track down relatives of Jack McAvoy, please get in touch. If you'd like to read the Jack's 2 citations and see where they crossed out the Victoria Cross, which John actually made available in that interview, They are available on the Australian War Memorial website, and you can easily search for him under the service number of 6071. So, that was very easy to find and look up, saying, you think you're getting the Victoria Cross, and we're just going to cross those out and go for the military medal instead. Now, John, patrons.
Yes. Patrons, yes.
Our lovely patrons.
I thought we'd come back straight into the patrons, but I messed that up. But here they are. So we're going to, because they give us the money that is paid for the equipment that is making this live stream
John's
possible.
got all sorts of new equipment that he loves to play with and works perfectly every time.
Yep. Okay, so we're going to thank the patrons. So in the top tier patrons, we've got Brian Jenkins, Chris Pezet, Cornelius Weber, Ian McGuinness, Jonathan Markle, Johnny Oot, Maxi Mixed and Pear. And in our other patrons, we have Anton Gorbanov, Carter Heller, Christoph Keller, Dan Sapienza, David Mulvaney, Elliot Spicer, Floaty Burb, Guy Hook, Hans Wang, Henry Hemmed, Jay Beckman Strauss, Jamie Stokes, Late Apex, Major Mansfield, Scotch 12, Steve Matthews, Tony L, and Vikram Murthy.
Thanks all.
Thank
you all very much.
We do enormously appreciate your, chipping in and letting us do things. And the technology's actually worked really well this episode. So, yay.
And for today, we have a new beer, John.
Okay.
Can you guess what this beer is? Anybody? Anyway, no, you have not, because it is the Valhalla Golden Ale. Because, well, let's face it, I'm not going to get a Russian beer or a Soviet beer in Canberra this day and age. But
where's it from?
That's a good question. Now let's see how my eyes. I'm assuming a light malt base with El Dorado.
El Dorado is a hop
Ella
variety,
and Amarillo hops,
tropical
and citrus fruit character, and a refreshing dry finish.
Now,
before
I taste it, I need to tell people I am triggered because I once bought an enormous amount of Amarillo hops, and it's a lovely hop, but once it's everything that's in your beer for 6 weeks, it's a little much. But yeah.
All right. Well, you asked where it was from. It's from the Cook local shops.
Where's it brewed?
Australia. It's an Australian beer. It's an Australian beer. But
right.
I said, well, you know what? Valhalla. I mean, those Rus were they're all about like the Norse. They were a bit Odin-esque and so forth, and they're all a bit Viking-esque. So I thought, right,
the Kievan Rus, which is the important thing to remember. It's a bit like Kosovo. The Serbs just viewed Kosovo as so integral to their national character, they ignored the fact that over 1,000 years people have moved in who had different ideas about things.
Come on, John. You got another glass here.
Okay. Yep. All right.
Switch
so I need to drink some of the Valhalla to have thoughts on it. Okay.
Yep.
While we are tasting the beer and getting ready for it, a lot's happened since the last episode, and one of those things
it's got a skull right on the on the can. And it's wow, that's a very citrusy flavour.
Just give me a second to talk about this before we talk about the beer. One of the things that's happened is Joe Biden is no longer the Democratic presidential nominee.
Was that only a month ago?
Yeah.
Wow, so much has happened since then.
But the thing I really want to say is an enormous number of people have come out saying, "Oh, Joe Biden, what a great human being, what a great president. Thank you for your service."
He's been in politics longer than we've been alive.
Oh yeah, no, he entered the Senate before
he was 29.
Color television was invented.
Yes.
But my point that I will never go away from is he is not a great human being, because he has presided over a genocide and he had the ability to stop it and he did nothing. And you cannot tell me he is a great human being. Sorry. Okay. But let's move on.
He's no Donald Trump.
Trump did not kill many people when he was president.
That's more due to incompetence rather than...
Trump is a terrible human being, and more to the point, the terrible human beings who surround him are even worse. Trump killed less people, a very small number of people. He doesn't like killing people, and I too do not like killing people. Anyway,
good for you, John.
Let's move on from that.
All right, Valhalla Brewing from North Geelong. Refreshing dry.
That has got a dry hop nose on it.
Yep. Okay. Refreshing dry finish makes this all-day smasher to conquer even the most dangerous thirst.
There is no way this is an all-day beer.
No,
This is a one-and-done beer. I'm not saying it's a bad beer.
No.
I'm saying it is so floral and fragrant that you would not want to have more than one.
Very fruity. It is very fruity.
Fruity as hell. We've got a problem in that we're going to have to drink it before we have another beer to talk about.
Well, you don't have to get onto that one. We can take our time with this, and you can always go back to your Commander's Reserve if you feel like.
Anyway, I would never make a beer like this for myself to drink. I'm not.
But it has a skull with curly blonde hair right on the can.
My point is, I'm not disputing the quality of its manufacture. I can discern no faults. It's just entirely not to my liking.
I got to say, it's not particularly to mine, but I'm going to drink it anyway because why not?
And I have had thoughts for a long time about craft beers that go over the top on the floral perfumed stuff, and that's what we got here.
Yeah, floral perfume all the way.
Okay. Okay, moving on to second half subjects, and trust us, we are going to get to Ukraine. But The Economist in their daily podcasts that I just get on my Google Home, even though I'm no longer an Economist subscriber. I was for a number of years. But they were saying that both the Baltic countries and the UK are studying the way Hamas is defending against Israel, because the concept of fighting an overwhelming armoured force with your backs to the sea is extremely interesting to them.
But is Hamas actually doing very well against?
Well, they've lost like 3 brigades out of their 50 brigades that they had. Israel has not degraded them enormously. They're still fighting. We're still seeing a population of 2 million people being genocided so that Israeli real estate speculators can build some condominiums on the sea, which is the worst reason to kill people that's ever existed.
But it's happening. It's happening right now because they want to have the real estate on the sea. Yeah.
And it's not like they don't have a fair coastline. Their whole country's mostly coastline. But anywho, look, we're going to quickly get through the Israel stuff because it makes me nervous, because I don't want to be seen as being anti-Semitic. I am not. I don't want to be seen as being anti-Israeli. I have had an enormous number of Israeli friends through my life. I am anti-Netanyahu. I am anti the Netanyahu government. I am anti-Zionist.
Anti-genocide?
I'm extremely anti-genocide. And it's weird that this has become a controversial position.
The fact that you don't want to see women and children blown up by armoured tank brigades running through their cities as they get crushed under their tracks.
In fact, what we're talking about weird, now might be the moment to mention that we now have the prospect of a Tim Walz, J.D. Vance debate. The vice presidential debate. And for the first time in history, we're going to see a sergeant major and a corporal debating each other. Because Tim Walz was the first enlisted officer to be elected to Congress ever, which is a real insight into the class system.
And J.D. Vance is being a corporal,
became an Ohio senator,
becoming into the Senate. Yeah, wow.
So anyway, enlisted represent. We're all for that. So now there's a real possibility that Israel's going to invade southern Lebanon in the near future.
Invade southern Lebanon again. Yeah, you missed out the again part.
Yeah,
because
they do it every now and then, and then mostly sometimes they do okay at the start, and then everything goes to hell, and sometimes it just goes badly all the way along. I just want to, this idea that Israel just owns any land that it likes the look of, because they the Jews lived in Israel back in the 2,000 years ago. I'm of Welsh descent. My name's Griffiths. People know that. I don't get to just rock up in Wales and be presented with the keys to Carnarvon Castle. Rob's put a note in here. Shadowversity, who's got some issues with the YouTube channel, but I do watch him. He does have a really good take on Carnarvon Castle.
He's an Australian. He's done his tour of Carnarvon Castle and really enjoyed it. And look, it was fun and exciting. And being Australian, it was nice to watch him. But
Yeah. Anyway, the point is, Netanyahu is literally said in his address to Congress that Israel has a right to all of biblical Samaria and Judea, and it's like no one has a right to anything that's in a document that was written 2,000 years ago. That it's just no longer applicable, and that's pretty much all of the West Bank. So it's just saying we're going to take all of this land that these people are living on, and we don't care where they go.
And my other note I've just put in to the script was it's probably all the Romans' fault.
Yeah, well, probably is.
Probably is all
them or the Templars, right? And
well, 2,000 years ago it was the Romans' fault. 1,000 years ago it was the Templars' fault.
Now, look, we're going to get back to tanks real soon, and this is tank adjacent, so bear me out here. Netanyahu speaking to the US Congress, which just made my blood boil. He made a big point of describing Palestinians as barbarous. Now, trust the Australians here.
That's us.
When we tell you that calling other people's barbarians is a pitch for stealing those poor bastards' lands, it's that's just what you do. You say, "Oh, they're barbarians. They don't know what to do. They can't be trusted with it."
It's not really
our
their
real
land.
estate developers are the people who need to have that land
Because they're the ones paying for us to be in government.
Yeah. Okay. Let's talk about Ukraine now.
Oh,
way more tank adjacent. It's worth talking about. There's been articles about how in the last couple of months the Russians have been losing 30,000 soldiers per month. Now that's killed and casualties, but some casualties come back from recoveries. Some are just ruined for life, and a huge drain on their families for life.
And just remember that they are actually people. They're people probably not without choice, and they've been forced in this situation, and it's not a good situation. Right, so we just got to remember that we can drink beer and laugh because we're on the safe side of the world, but at the end of the day, it's 30,000 people per month who are having their lives ruined.
They had mothers, they had, and also the Ukrainians are suffering casualties in this conflict as well. But anyway, and the issue that's interesting is there's a view, particularly we've talked about earlier in this episode, that the Russians can't sustain their mechanical losses past 2025. They're going to run out of T-62s in the scrapyards. So the issue is, where is the line of control going to be at the time of the peace negotiation? And if you think that isn't important, go have a look at the history of the Korean War, where there was enormous number of Americans and British and Australians died making sure that a particular hill was held at the peace negotiations.
So they could say, okay, we'll give you, if you march 3 kilometers further north than Seoul, we'll give you this hill that's 50 k's away, slightly above the 38th parallel.
Yeah. So who holds the line at the moment of the negotiation is enormously important, and unfortunately, people's lives are being ruined about that. So what you're seeing in Ukraine, and I wrote this before the Kursk breakout, which we are going to get to, it still holds up in that it's about where you can draw the lines, and the Russians have been burning an enormous number of human beings' lives to have the best possible position. Anywho. Red Effect on the new Indian light tank, which we talked about this tank last week, but
last month.
Last month. Red Effect did a really good video. Apparently, there's a Belgian company called, I think, Cockerell, and they designed the whole turret. So the L7 gun that's in there.
Well, the Cockerell guns have been used in a number of different vehicles.
Cockerell guns or Cockerell turrets?
Yeah, turrets. With guns. They throw them into a number of different vehicles. But yes, go.
Ooh. So it's just interesting that basically India has, they've been burned by the Arjun program. There's no doubt about that. And what they've done is said, okay, we're going to get the turret, which is that's most of the systems integration is what's in the turret. Pop it in from Cockerell. We're buying. I'm guessing, but I'm pretty sure it's going to be a German diesel engine in the back, and then putting a bit of steel around the outside of that, and building tracks. That's lower order work, but it's it's certainly going to be interesting because lots of other countries can take that Cockerel turret and put it in their thing because the Belgians will sell to anyone.
Oh, good, yeah. But
Yeah.
no, I mean they've done it with various other, as I was saying, other tanks before, whether it's the 90 mil or 105 mil guns or whatever. They can say, well, we'll just build this and provide it to you and go in. All right, Ukraine invading Russia towards Kursk.
A mechanized core invasion into Russia. This is
it's not
amazing, and we don't know how it's happening. But
from what I've seen, there's no tanks. There's just armored fighting vehicles.
If those mechanized brigades have tanks attached, I
haven't seen anything that says there are tanks involved in the activity. That's why there are Striker, US Striker vehicles. There are all sorts of armored fighting vehicles, but there are no tanks involved. So I could be totally wrong, but from what I have seen shown online, yes, they have gone into Russia towards Kursk. What their objective is, we don't know. What outcome they're wanting to get, we don't know. But the fact is, they've done it. They've taken steps that, what I was saying probably 8 months ago, saying, well, rather than going through the minefields, how about we just go around? Yeah. Which is what they've done by saying, well, you know that borderline that you said we're not allowed to cross, but you're saying we are allowed to charge through these minefields. How about we just go across that line that you've told us we're not allowed to go across and just do that?
Okay, now I have a thought on that, which is the Ukrainians have been abiding by the rules the Americans give them with equipment sales. And then they have watched, we all know they've been watching, Israel ignore every rule about every weapon that they're sent.
Yes, that's a really good point.
And Ukraine has looked at that and said, well, the corpse emperor is asleep on the throne.
That's a Warhammer 40K reference.
But the corpse emperor is asleep on the throne. We can ignore all their rules and nothing's going to change. And so Ukraine is blown through an enormous number of red lines. But good luck to them, because as we discussed months ago, what they had to do was get around the Russian defenses. That's why D-Day was on the beaches of Normandy. You don't attack the enemy where they're strong; you attack them where they're weak.
Yes.
And so they've changed the rules of the game by assaulting into Kursk. The worry is an armored core, a mechanized core, although it definitely has armor in it, as Tasman has noted, that's a lot to lose, and any assault is creating a salient to be cut across, and but Ukraine have been, one thing they've done throughout this war is fight in close to cut off salients and then withdraw in time. So hopefully, because we
kind of expected this is a case of we're going to go in and smash stuff up and then run them back across the border and say, right, come get us if you think you're hard enough. But it's not a case of we're going to smash our way in and say, we're going to hold this land. I don't think they're going to try and hold it. I think it's a case of we're just going to make everybody miserable by going in there and saying, you need to move strategic reserves from elsewhere to here to stop us doing this again, because otherwise you'll start losing popularity at home in Moscow. And that is the important thing, is affecting how people in Moscow think of Vlad.
I think more to the point, this is about setting the table for the peace negotiations.
I think that's a really good point of saying, well, if something happens come November and they are forced to go to negotiate for peace, then making sure what land is held by whom is and can be negotiated one way or the other is a very important point, because if you don't hold any of the other person's land, then you can't negotiate to get your own back, and that might be very important. All right, and as we speak, the Russians, John, are invading New York.
Yes, the Russians are invading New York.
Oh my God, they're invading New York. Who would have thought it? Just like in 2008 when the Russians were invading Georgia. Mm-hmm. I remember looking up, trying to look up Georgia, and Google Maps was showing me the United States state of Georgia, but it would not show me the Republic of Georgia in the Caucasus.
Mm. Or in the case of Georgia, the Georgia Islands near the Falklands.
Mm. There you go.
Turns out You know, you don't meet too many girls called Georgia, but they're always good value.
That's true. I went on a dive trip with Georgia once. She was lovely, and I think she still works at the ANU. Anyway, but yes, the Russians are invading New York at the moment. It's a small town in eastern Ukraine.
Donetsk, I think. Anyway.
Zaporizhzhia. I don't know. Anyway, and it might be spelt NIU York, but it was definitely named after the city itself, the city that never sleeps, New York itself. Anyway.
Now, getting back to beer, Alan has asked a question: how can it be fruity and dry? And that, Alan, is about dry hopping of beer, which produces sweet flavors that aren't actually sugary, which is a bit weird. And in my own home brewing, I never use dry hopping. I think it's the business of the devil, but most craft beer uses it enormously. And so it's a bit like aspartame in that it goes in there as a flavor that presents on the palate as sweet, but there's no actual sugar in it.
And we were thinking about how many beers we need to bring down for this segment, but I'll tell you what, one will do us because we are
nearly done. This podcast has been going for 2 hours and 14 minutes, and it's getting close to being enough.
And we're back to the poll of 20 votes, a bit meh, 40%, and transformative for the T-62, 60%. So the ayes have it. The
weirdly enough, having presented the information that we chose to present, people have taken what we said as the thing.
We're very persuasive that way.
Yeah. Yes. Anyway, the poll is with us once again. So thank you. Thank you, poll voters, for supporting us. Speaking of poll voters, what about that French dude?
Was he French or Italian? Anyway,
the point is he had an enormous dong, and now the whole world knows he has an enormous dong, but he didn't win a medal, and he's like, well, you know.
I can live with that.
Worst things happen at sea.
Computer losses.
Yeah. All right. So, folks, we thank you so. Remind you once again, if you want to get into researching, give us some thoughts on John McAvoy and his family, so that Martin can present them with a commemorative VC. And Obliteron says he won our hearts.
He did. He did.
Yeah. Okay, and on that note, Rob, we are done. We will be back in about a month.
Sometime.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right.
Okay, folks.
Take care. We love you all, and enjoy the next month. And let's see how the world turns out. Thank you all.